So what's the premier choice of anti-tank for Space Marine Devastators then? Is it the missile launcher or the Lascannon? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're looking at some of the maths behind the Space Marine Devastator squad. Namely, we're looking at a unit that can sit in your deployment zone and blow some enemy armour to bits from long range. With this in mind, we're going to take a look at the maths behind the missile launcher versus the Lascannon against a few different targets that will commonly come across in 40k. So the two units that we're going to look at are two Devastator squads that are balanced pretty much evenly in points. First of all, we have the Lascannon squad. We'll be taking 3 Lascannons, an Armorium Cherub, and a couple of extra Marines to tank some wounds. I think this will be a pretty typical loadout for a Devastator squad, and I think it strikes the right sort of balance between having a few extra bodies about, so you're not immediately losing heavy weapons from the first time you get shot, while still packing quite a lot of a punch. So with 3 Lascannons and 7 Devastators and a Cherub, the squad will cost 171 points. Facing off against them, we have the missile launchers. As they're a fair bit cheaper, we'll be using 4 missile launchers in that same squad of 7 Devastators and an Armorium Cherub. This loadout comes to 176 points, so it is a tiny bit more expensive, though only 3% difference, which won't have the biggest impact on the maths. And we'll be calculating the Devastator's average damage output over the first 3 turns of the game, so they'll use up their Armorium Cherub in the first turn, and then be firing normally in the next 2. I think again this is pretty reasonable, as by turn 3 there's a reasonable chance that they're either dead, or it might not matter quite so much anymore, as you possibly won the game. So without further ado, let's look at what sort of impact they make when they fire upon their target. So our first little chart has our Devastators firing in Devastator Doctrine against a Rhino, a Contemptor Dreadnought, a Leman Russ and an Imperial Knight. And the results are interesting, and they show that these two weapons are quite well balanced. The Missile Launcher Devastator squad does better when it's targeting a Toughness 7 target. It's fairly close against the Rhino, due to the Lascannon's advantage in AP, but when your target has an invul save, as the Contemptor Dreadnought does, that AP bonus is negated, so the Missile Launchers have quite a decent lead over it there. On the other hand, when your target is Toughness 8, the Lascannon's extra strength will slightly win out, in quite a big way on the Leman Russ target, but when there's an invul save, it's a bit more even, though the Lascannon still slightly triumphs. I've also done the maths for if you're not in Devastator Doctrine, which I think is still important to consider because you might be using this in a army that doesn't want to be in Devastator Doctrine, such as say Ultramarines. In this case, the missile launchers only very slightly triumph on the Rhino, and due to their slight extra points cost, they're actually very slightly behind the Lascannons in terms of points efficiency. Similarly, the missile launchers fall slightly further behind when you're targeting at Leman Russ, due to that lower AP hampering them more. Interestingly though, when you're comparing against the targets with invul saves, the maths doesn't change at all, because of course both of these weapons will put the targets to a 5-up invul, whether they're in Devastator Doctrine or not. So overall, I think that the Missile Launcher and Lascannon are actually really quite well balanced when it comes to deciding which anti-tank weapon you're going to use. If you want to be shooting at Toughness 8 targets, Lascannons are generally your best bet. If you're going to be aiming more at Toughness 7 or below targets, Missile Launchers are slightly better. I think that the two options really are quite well balanced though. The efficiency against most targets is pretty similar, so I certainly wouldn't feel too bad if you only have one of these models and don't want to go rushing out to buy the other. One thing you could consider for a Devastator squad would maybe including one Lascannon and a few missile launchers, because the Lascannon can then be the one to benefit from the Signum, which will allow it to hit on a 2-up, and you can also use the Armorium Cherub on the Lascannon as well. That way you get both of these to buff the powerful gun, and the slightly weaker missile launchers can just fire without the help of these powerful buffs. That could certainly be a way to squeeze a little bit of extra efficiency out of your Devastator squad. There are another couple of little things to consider. Firstly, the missile launchers have a frag mode, which means that they can lend a little bit of extra anti-horde should you really be faced with absolutely nothing but infantry. Bear in mind though that the frag mode is a ridiculously expensive way to get a few more strength 4 shots. Space Marine lists typically have strength 4 shots at decent AP all over the place. For example, if you did manage to get one aggressor to double fire. then he's going to be doing far more than your entire frag missile Devastator squad would do on average with their 4 frag missiles. It's a little extra nice to have if you absolutely need to scrub out a few more infantry from long range, but I personally wouldn't be buying the missile launchers with that in mind. The frag missiles are definitely a fallback, use them when I've accepted that I've got no real use for any anti-tank guns this turn. I certainly wouldn't be aiming to play around them in normal circumstances. On the other hand, an advantage for the Lascannons is that you can field them in a bigger, more powerful unit. If you do include all 4 Lascannons and maybe include the full 10 Space Marines to tank wounds for them, they'll be absolutely making the maximal use out of any fancy buffs or stratagems you might be able to use on them with your Codex supplement. Say any Chaplain litanies, any stratagems like the Salamander's +1 to wound 1, or any psychic powers as well, will generally have the most efficiency when you're targeting the biggest, most points intensive unit. So if you want to go the whole hog, field 4 Lascannons and a bunch of screening Space Marines, the Lascannons might be the thing for you. So in summary, pretty well balanced. I'd happily take either, maybe bearing in mind whether my list suffers more against heavy armour or light armour. But now we're going to throw in a bit of a curveball, because there's another gun that these Devastators can bring that puts out some very decent anti-tank firepower at long range, and that is the Plasma Cannon. So let's take a quick look at its numbers now. So the unit that we're looking at is 4 Plasma Cannon Devastators, and they're really quite cheap weapons at 16 points per, making the squad with the Armorium Cherub a comparatively cheap 160 points, so decently below the others. Now, provided you can get them in range, they actually are more efficient against every single one of these targets than either the missile launcher or the Lascannon, and they remain to be whether or not you're in Devastator Doctrine. They particularly excel when they're hunting Toughness 7 armour without an invul save, so rhinos are going to be absolutely toasted by Plasma Cannon Devastators. But as we can see, they decently outcompete all the other Devastators against all targets, while also being a nice 10 points cheaper and just as durable. Now obviously the Plasma Cannons do have some downsides. 36-inch range is significantly shorter than 48, so you might struggle to reach your enemy's backline tanks, or you might have to deploy them a bit further forward and put them more in harm's way, neither of which are ideal. Having long range is a real advantage of the other Devastators. It gives them more options and it keeps them safer. Secondly is the fact that the Plasma Cannons have to overcharge to do this damage. This means that it's pretty much mandatory that you're going to need a captain nearby. Now this isn't a bad thing at all, and you might well be wanting to put a captain near your Devastators anyway to get the most out of their firepower. It's not a bad move, but the Plasma Cannons sort of rely on it, otherwise they're going to be blowing themselves up left, right and centre. Also, because of this overcharge, they're going to be extra unsafe if they're trying to move and shoot, or if they're trying to target an enemy unit that has a -1 to hit. Both of those make them quite risky even if you do have captain rerolls nearby. But I do think that with Space Marines in the meta quite so much at the moment, we are seeing a few fewer -1 to hit modifiers. Despite the lower range and higher risk of firing Plasma Cannons, they also have some other upsides. They're far better against heavy infantry. They're particularly efficient at frying things like Primaris Marines, which we seem to be seeing quite a lot in the meta these days. Also, if they are hunting anything like 1 wound infantry with decent saves, they don't actually have to overcharge, so you would have the option of degrading your efficiency of firepower a little for keeping your Devastators safe, which is good to have that option. They also benefit the best from the Imperial Fist doctrine of hunting tanks. I know Imperial Fist players just love their heavy bolters, but if you did consider swapping them out for Plasma Cannons, they'll be significantly more efficient against tanks than your heavy bolter Devastators would be. That strength 8 and decent AP, as well as having plenty of shots, really adds up. It's worth noting that Iron Hands also mitigates a lot of the negatives of Plasma Cannons by giving them those all-important reroll 1s at all times, and also letting them move and fire with no penalty so they're not blowing themselves up. Obviously the Lascannons and missile launchers also get benefits from Imperial Fists and Iron Hands, but they don't benefit as much from Imperial Fists, and the Iron Hands covers the Plasma Cannon's weakness, as well as buffing its strength, so these two Devastator-focused chapters are particularly good for Plasma Cannon devs. So overall, in the contest of missile launchers versus Lascannons, my main conclusion is that Lascannons for heavy armour, missile launchers for light armour, but they're both fairly balanced and will do you reasonably well against either target. But you should also be considering whether or not plasma cannons might be more helpful to your army by trading some range and needing some protection against overcharge for that much higher damage efficiency and lower points investment. So overall, I think that they're all viable options, and it kind of depends what you need most out of your unit. Please let me know what your thoughts are on all of this maths and how it would best translate into real games. I've tried to imagine some real scenarios for 40k and how it'll actually play out on the battlefield, but obviously theory is all well and good as to whether it actually translates into real situations, so I'd be interested to hear about how your Devastators have been performing on the tabletop. As you can see, I've not included the Grav Cannon in this comparison. That's mainly because I feel it fills a bit of a different role, and I have made a full video on Grav Cannon Devastators coming out of drop pods. It's a vicious little tactic and has a potentially very high damage output, so feel free to have a look at that video if you're interested in that. As always, thanks for listening. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this, and if there's any other decent maths comparisons that you think would be worth doing. I'll hope to see you guys in the next video.